Well, I hope you enjoyed the film. I've seen it now 3 or 4 times, and I find it profoundly touching each time. What we're going to have now is a panel discussion. Well, let me introduce the panels. We're all graduates of the S.J. Quinney College of Law. We're all Vietnam vets. At the far end is Michael Jorgensen. He graduated with me in 1974. He lives in Salina and is retired. He served in Vietnam in 1970 and 71. Next to him is Larry Lawrence Peterson, who graduated with me in 1974. He's currently a partner in the law firm of Peterson Nykamp Law in Salt Lake City. He was commissioned as a lieutenant in the U.S. Army Infantry and served in Vietnam from July 1970 to May 1971. And next to me is Chris Wangsgaard. He graduated from West Point in 1963, graduated from the College of Law in 1972. He served a tour in Vietnam and was on active duty for 6 years. So, actually, would the panelists be willing to share some of their feelings about the film? I don't know that you've seen it before. Michael?
You want me to start? The one thing about the film, I don't mean to demean anybody's experience or criticize anybody's experience. Everybody's experience in Vietnam, the way they came home was entirely different. The one thing that bothered me about the film is that the portrayal of the protesters. I think the protesters probably kept the social conscience alive about Vietnam and probably saved another 60,000, 100,000 lives.
Larry?
Well, I enjoyed watching the film very much. Had opportunity this week to think about my experience in Vietnam more than I've done for a long time. When I came home from Vietnam, the perception was that everybody who was over there was crazy. And when they came home, they were dangerous. Or you felt that anyway. And then you'd go to these movies they made about Vietnam, and the movies, I thought, were made to make everybody else in the country crazy too. So we were all crazy together when it was through. And I think that's true. I think the emphasis in this film about PTSD, I don't think I have PTSD. I don't know that I've ever had any symptoms that I'd admit to or recognize. But I think it's a common human experience. I'm sure that a lot of protesters, for example, suffer a form of PTSD where they wonder, did I really avoid that because I was a coward? Did I really not find out what my limits are, or what I can do? Did I really not serve my country because of a failing in me? So I think this idea that Vietnam veterans are uniquely PTSD afflicted is, I guess I would not think so. I think it's the common human experience, and Vietnam is just one more iteration of that.
Chris?
For me, the film, as powerful as it is unsatisfying, and I disagree fairly strongly with the implied portrayal that the problem for the Vietnam vet had to do with what happened when we came home. The problem, the injury, the wrong done to those who served in Vietnam was the wrongness of sending them there for the very poor reasons for which they were sent. That problem can't be touched in an hour, and the film did what it did quite well. I'm pretty critical of what it didn't undertake.
Chris teaches courses about the Vietnam War through the Osher Institute, so if you're interested to know about the war from a person who is really an expert in its history, his classes would be recommended. I also want to recognize, we have a Gold Star mother here, Alice Telford. Her son John was killed in Vietnam in 1967. So let's talk about the ethics of sending our young men and women into harm's way for wars that are unwinnable. I think we all recognize that Vietnam was an unwinnable war. So is the war in Iraq, and so is the war in Afghanistan. So, Michael, what do you think about that?
Well, I'm not sure it was an unwinnable war. The way it was fought, it was unwinnable. I think the U.S. had the power, the resources, if they wanted to conquer North Vietnam and occupy it, they could have. The way it was fought, it was just a sacrifice of human life and dignity. Where I was, what I did was, I was a MAT team member, which was two officers and 3 NCOs that worked with the local forces, and I lived on the economy for a year. I think Larry's experience was the same. And I digress a little bit from the question. I'll get back to the question, and then if you want to go into the other, I will. But at the time, what we were sold was we were going to stop the red tide. Look at it now, and I don't know, we can second guess whether we did anything or not. But did the war in Korea do anything? Did the war in Vietnam do anything? Would the world be the same now? I don't know how we make that moral judgment. We can make the moral judgment on what we did and how it was done, but whether it was right or wrong, I don't know how we guess what the world would be now if we hadn't done what we did.
Larry, your thoughts?
You know, the ethics of this, I think, are very pertinent to our current situation. And this film does a great job of demonstrating that conflict. You know, without soldiers and without policemen, there's no government. And without government, there's no law or order. We have methods for hoping and trying to make our government make correct decisions, but it's certainly not guaranteed. Kind of a hit and miss proposition, and maybe in the future. So we have to decide as a society and as individuals how much we treat those who enforce the rules of government made according to the rule of law upon those who don't agree with those rules. So I think as an ethics exercise, this is a great little case history to see how we're going to react in the near future and in the distant future to those who we ask to enforce the laws we make on those who don't want to have laws enforced upon them. So how we treat our policemen, how we treat our soldiers is an ethical issue, I think.
Chris?
Those who served in Vietnam were fulfilling their contract with the rest of us and with our government. It's hard to imagine a worse card one could have drawn than to have been one of those grunt soldiers. It was beyond a bad bargain. Looking over at Judge Jenkins, I'm of course reminded that one of our transcendent ideas in the law is that all contracts have written into them an implied covenant of good faith and fair dealing. Americans, we can get in a hot dog fight very quickly about whether the war could have been won or should have been won, but I think we can agree that our country breached that implied faith of good faith and fair dealing with respect to everyone who was sent to serve in Vietnam. And if something like this film provides some recompense for that, then fine.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the draft, because, not every soldier who went over was drafted. I think all of us were volunteered to go, in effect.
I think Mr. Peterson and I disagree.
But the draft ended, and Nixon ended the draft, toward the end of the Vietnam War, and we haven't had an effective military draft since then, and we've had an all-volunteer force. So I'm curious, and I think this is an ethical issue for the country as well. I'm curious to see what you think of reinstituting at least a form of national service for our young people. Michael?
I don't know what I think about that. I've had two sons that have been in the National Guard. One son's been to Iraq twice, so I think he's done his duty. Whether everybody should do that experience, I don't know. It's a question that I don't know. I was drafted, question I put, and out of curiosity, I drug out my draft card. It wasn't burned. And when Jim talked about doing this program, he said, what are some of the ethical things? And, that question I posed back to him is, if I'd dodged, evaded, avoided the draft, somebody else would have filled the quota out of my draft board. If that person would have been killed, would that have been my fault for what I've done? Whether everybody ought to have that obligation, responsibility, I don't know.
Larry?
The only comment I'd make about the draft is, if we're going to have a draft, we need to make it universal. I think one of the offensive things about it is that it was so easy to avoid the draft, and there were so many techniques for getting out of Vietnam employed back at that time. And so the implication was that only the stupid went to Vietnam, and everybody else had a way of getting out of it. So if we're going to have a draft, and I guess I don't have an opinion, only if we need one, but if we have one, we ought to make it absolutely universal and not let the rich and famous dodge it.
Well, I think your question touches on an important issue for us. I don't think the draft is quite the answer. The problem that I see is that such a very, very small percentage of Americans actually participate in military service, and our socioeconomic stratification sees to it that those are our poorest sons and daughters. We have become a great deal like the British when they were running their empire under their land system of primogeniture. The oldest son always inherited the estate, so the second sons went out to the frontier of India and British colonies and served in the Navy and fought on the frontiers of the empire. Well, we're sending our second and third sons to places like Iraq and Afghanistan and the 20 or 30 other places that they are. I have come to feel, for me, the phrase "thank you for your service" has come to carry a taint of hypocrisy, because to me the unspoken, the part that doesn't get said at the end of that is, oh, and by the way, thank you for taking care of these issues so that I and my family don't have to think about it. And I think that is a problem, the lack of connection and lack of responsibility for the reasons for which we send people to places like Vietnam and Iraq and Afghanistan.
Let me build on two different points. Currently, about 1% of our population serve in the voluntary military. So this tremendous burden of military service falls on a very tiny footprint. And as Chris said, that enables us to forget about it. And many of us don't think about what our young men and women are doing in Iraq and Afghanistan today and what they've done for the last decade. And many of these people have been sent on 4 and 5 or more tours of combat. When we served, we served 12 or 13 months, and we knew we were coming home, and that was it. And these multiple tours put huge burdens on families, and the divorce among our current service folks is really quite high. And I don't know that we fully appreciate them. So I think we've got about 10 minutes left, and I think...
Can I make one more comment?
Sure,
on that
absolutely,
issue, too?
yeah.
You know, the film makes an issue of being called baby killers, and the implication is that everything that we did in Vietnam was some kind of a quasi-criminal activity. And I think that's a misperception of what the military does worldwide and what it did in Vietnam. I think I was in Vietnam with MACV, which was a military advisory command, and I made a lot of good Vietnamese friends, and we went to war together. We went out and tried to pacify the local neighborhood. I came back to this law school and was studying, and they had an NVA guy come from Vietnam and he was feted on campus, and the campus newspaper wrote up a glowing report about democracy going on in Vietnam, and I wrote a little responsive letter saying, well, I know how democracy was enforced in Vietnam because we walked into one village and watched 2 ladies spooning what was left of the brains of the 80-year-old village chief back into what was left of his skull. So I was helping the local neighborhood. I recently went to New York City and made friends with the Consul General in New York for Vietnam, and he invited me to go and listen to the President of Vietnam give a talk in New York after he'd met with President Obama and was going back to Vietnam. And he said, well, we want you soldiers to come back to Vietnam because we know when you were there, you thought you were serving the best interests of our country, which I thought was a very enlightened thing to say. And I think that's true of the military today in places like Iraq and other places. They're trying to do the best they can for these people and for us. And so the perception that there's something wrong with military service, and there was something wrong with military service in Vietnam other than the fact that the war was mistaken, it needs to be, it's a little more complex than that. So.
I think we have an opportunity for questions from the audience. And we have a microphone.
Okay. I'd like to respond to Chris's objection about the documentary. Since I worked on it, I was there at the inception of it. I was the senior editor for the book, so I'd like to explain what our thinking was when we conceived of this film. It wasn't intended to be comprehensive. We knew that there were so many angles that we could cover for this documentary. The controversy, the history had been done ad nauseum. We wanted to focus on something positive and focused on something that would mean a lot to the veterans. Our whole purpose, really, in working on this project, in interviewing Jim and doing all of that, was to do something for the veterans. This was a project that we had talked about for years, and it was one of the most profoundly moving things I've ever done.
Thank you.
Yeah, if you don't know, that was Elayne Harmer, and she with her sister helped to produce this great movie, make this great movie, so I just wanted to give acknowledgement to Elayne Harmer for her great work. One of the great movies that I think brings us home is Born on the 4th of July, Oliver Stone's great movie. If you could get past a lot of that harsh language about Ron Kovic and his dealings with coming home as well, were pretty harsh, and most of that, and I'd say is pretty much true. I mean, he went to the National Convention, the Democratic National Convention, and received a terrible welcome there, you know. But my question is that, you know, we have one of the most patriotic assemblies in the Stadium of Fire, and I think it's a beautiful celebration for us. And I had the opportunity to sit down. We have a section where the military veterans get to sit. We have a special section where we put them. And I was not sitting too far away from them, and I noticed that, you know, the fireworks, every time we set them off, they jump, you know. And it kind of concerns me, and I'm wondering, you know, even though fireworks are great, I'm wondering if it's in the best interest to use fireworks as a celebration for our military people, because, you know, what they're going through. It just made me cry to see some of these guys just have to respond every time those fireworks went off because of their problems they're dealing with. Is that a valid question?
While we're waiting for the mic to be passed, I want to recognize Elayne, and who also worked with her sister on a film about the Korean War called The Remembered War, which is also very touching. So if you have an opportunity to see that. I think you're working on another one now, is that right? World War II. So thank you.
May I say something, Jim?
Sure.
Oh, I love the fireworks. When I came home, I went deer hunting the first year after I came home, and didn't enjoy the shots then, but now it's great.
Depends on whether they sound like outgoing or incoming.
When they go click over your head, you know it's the right direction.
Then they shouldn't go. Then they shouldn't go. And that's my feeling. The one thing they talked about, the scope of the film and whatever, is that Larry and I had a similar experience as to where we worked. We worked with the local forces in small villages. I was in the base of the Central Highlands. He was near Cambodia. And when I watched the film, you know, we came home, and we're talking about how we came home. We served a year, and we got to come back here. There were those people. There was the lady that cooked the dinners, the food at the district headquarters. There's the ones that did our laundry, the mayors of the villages, the ones that fought with us, that stayed there. What happened to those people? That's the one thing that kind of haunts my mind, is all those people, Vietnamese people that worked with us and supported the U.S. military in Vietnam. What happened to them? How were they treated?
And we talked them into supporting the government, right? The
Yes.
government. The United States of America went over there and talked these people into putting their lives on the line for that government, and then we pull the rug out from under them and leave them to fend for themselves after we left the country. So
In the
it's
area,
a complicated issue.
the area I was in, there were several viewpoints. Those villagers that lived in the village during the day and elsewhere during the night considered a war of reunification. That's what Ho Chi Minh called it. It was to top the red tide. The particular area I was in, most of the people that lived there were Catholic. They came south from the north when the country was divided, and were there for the purpose of religious freedom, considered it a religious war. All those separate things, what happened to those people when we walked away?
And we've done it as a country a couple times since then, too. You know, we go around the country talking people into supporting local revolutions and local democracies, and then we don't support them after it gets a little difficult or a little expensive. We pull out and leave them to face the consequences. South America and Central America, other places.
If you want to look at that, Jim sent me some links to one of his speeches where he talked about when we did Iraq, and my son was part of it, we wiped the management, the government. He can tell you more about that, and left a void. Did we do the same thing in Vietnam? I don't know.
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Here, I know mine's on.
Three quick things. Number one, I want to mention that I had the opportunity to study with Chris at the Osher Institute, and to those that haven't participated either in the Institute or his programs, his was absolutely outstanding, just outstanding. And in this go around, getting a fix on how the Vietnam War actually evolved and taking a look at the history of it. Secondly, I want to mention to the producer or the associate producer that's here, I do video production, and I think technically, as well as from a, everybody will offer an opinion on it, but I think technically it's just outstanding how you put that together. And thirdly, I would like to get a little bit more information on the current status of PTSD with our veterans that are here now, and it could be both Iraq, Afghanistan, and Vietnam, but how this is being, how service is being implemented for it today, how it's being taken care of. I don't think it's being ignored, but I think it's still in some of the preliminary stages of being recognized as a real issue, as it is among firemen, paramedics, police officers, that type of thing. But if I could get maybe a little more commentary on this, what's actually happening, I would appreciate it.
Well, I can tell you a little bit about what's happening here at the University of Utah. We have a PhD psychologist, Craig Bryan, and he and his wife have developed a PTSD treatment program that goes, I think, over 12 sessions. And it's evidence-based, and it's been determined to be very, very effective. The other thing that I think is also true is that not everybody who serves in combat returns with PTSD. And some people who weren't in combat but were in the military do have PTSD. So they're trying to find out what are the risk factors for PTSD, because it's less than a quarter, I think, of our service people have PTSD. Any other comments?
People who serve in other industries have PTSD.
Oh, absolutely, yeah, absolutely.
And I worked as a guardian ad litem for several years and watched the children with PTSD, and there's a lot of work being done on PTSD. Now, whether it's successful or effective, I guess we'll know in a few years.
We were drafted to be on this committee, so we sit through the movie and then sit up here, and I know you people are looking at us and asking, what form of PTSD is that guy suffering?
The only PTSD they have is whatever I've inflicted on them as a part of being on this panel, I think. Well, we've reached... one more question. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, I myself was a member of the all-volunteer military force, but then I also moved on to the defense contract world, where I actually spent almost 3 years in Afghanistan. You guys all have the very unique perspective of watching us go from a draft, a nation that uses the draft, to a nation that has more and more relied on private contractors, third country nationals. We just barely started to talk about that with this question here. What do you guys think of the legal and the ethical implications of the returning home of people who simply didn't wear a uniform but were exposed to all of that?
Chris?
Yeah, I don't think
It's
I
tough,
have an
yeah.
opinion about that. One thing that goes through my mind is this. Some of the best writing I've read about PTSD says that a recurring trigger, a recurring theme that seems to cause it is a sense of betrayal. And so my reaction to that would be that, well, the experiences would seemingly be a lot the same. Maybe there would be a sense that there would be less of a risk because you went to it knowing what you were going to encounter. In my experience, I think it helped a lot that I saw myself as a professional. I served with highly elite professional soldiers. That was something like that was on another planet. It was our job. It was what we did, and it was essentially pretty close to what we expected.
And even with hazardous duty pay, they didn't pay you nearly as much as they do current contractors either.
Yeah, no comment, but you are absolutely right.
Oh, well, it's 5 after, so thank you very much. Remember that if you are a Vietnam veteran and you want to have a copy of this book, please come up afterwards and give me your contact information. Also, if you're a University of Utah veteran and you want this UVet lapel pin and this U Commander's coin, come up and give me your contact information because I'll get them to you. Thank you so much for supporting this program, and